You know, when you're young, you think war is all about tanks rolling through fields and fighter planes screaming overhead. You picture soldiers charging with rifles and grenades, heroism written in smoke and thunder. And sure, there's truth to that. But let me tell you something most folks don't realize. Wars aren't won just by the boys who pull triggers. Sometimes the real heroes are the ones who build the roads to victory. One steel beam and one pontoon at a time. I want to tell you about something that happened in the spring of 1945, right when the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if Hitler's Germany would finally fall. It's a story about a group of American engineers, ordinary young men, really, most of them barely old enough to have finished high school, who did something so audacious, so utterly unexpected, that it changed the course of the war in Europe. The Germans never saw it coming. Hell, even our own commanders could hardly believe it when it happened. This is the story of how American engineers crossed the Rhine River. Now, to understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand what the Rhine meant. It wasn't just any river. The Rhine was Germany's last natural fortress, the final barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. For centuries, it had been a moat protecting Central Europe. Over 800 feet wide in places, with currents that could sweep a man downstream faster than he could swim. With cold water that could kill you from hypothermia in minutes, the Rhine was a beast of a river. By March 1945, the Allied forces had been pushing eastward across Europe for months. They'd landed at Normandy the previous June, fought through the hedgerows of France, survived Hitler's desperate winter counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, and now they stood at the western edge of Germany, staring across that dark, swirling water. Every bridge the Germans had, and they'd built dozens of them over the years, was rigged with explosives. The German command had given strict orders. As the Allies approached, blow every bridge. Don't let a single span stand intact, and they were doing it. One by one, as American and British forces reached the Rhine at different points, they'd watch bridges explode in massive plumes of debris and smoke. Kilometers of steel and concrete tumbling into the water. It was strategic denial at its most effective. If the Allies wanted to cross, they'd have to do it the hard way, under fire, in boats, building temporary bridges while German artillery rained down on them. That's what made March 7, 1945, so remarkable. On that cold, drizzly afternoon, a reconnaissance unit from the 9th Armored Division, part of the U.S. First Army, was advancing toward a little German town called Remagen, about 14 miles south of Bonn. They weren't expecting much. Their orders were simple: reach the Rhine, secure the West Bank, and wait for further instructions. The soldiers figured any bridges would be long gone by the time they arrived. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman was leading Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. He was a young officer, just 22 years old, son of a German immigrant who'd served in the American Army during World War I. There's some irony in that, a German-American about to strike one of the most devastating blows against Nazi Germany. But that's America for you. We're made up of everybody. Timmerman's men were working their way through Remagen when somebody spotted something that made them all freeze. There, spanning the Rhine, was a bridge. And not just any bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, a massive railway trestle built during World War I. 3 spans of steel stretching 400 yards across the river. And it was still standing. For a moment, nobody could believe what they were seeing. The bridge was supposed to be destroyed. Every other bridge had been destroyed. But there it was, intact, with German soldiers and civilians still scurrying across it, trying to reach the eastern bank before the Americans arrived. Timmerman radioed his commander, Brigadier General William Hoge, who faced an impossible decision. If he ordered troops onto that bridge and the Germans blew it while his men were crossing, he could lose an entire company. Hundreds of soldiers killed or drowned in seconds. But if they captured that bridge intact, they could get tanks and troops across the Rhine weeks ahead of schedule. It was a gamble with impossibly high stakes. Hoge didn't hesitate. Get across that bridge, he ordered. What happened next was one of the most desperate foot races in military history. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Timmerman and his men rushed toward the bridge's western approach. They could see German engineers working frantically at the far end, trying to set off the demolition charges. Machine gun fire rattled from the stone towers on either side of the bridge. They'd been designed as defensive positions, and now the Germans were using them exactly as intended. The first explosion went off when Timmerman's men were halfway across. A massive charge near the western span detonated, blowing a crater in the approach and sending up a shower of stone and steel. For a moment, the entire bridge shuddered, but it didn't fall. The Americans kept running. Another explosion, this one at the central span. The entire structure seemed to lift into the air. Every man on that bridge thought he was about to die, thought he was about to plunge into that icy, churning water. But then the bridge settled back onto its foundations. It creaked, it groaned, but it held. The German engineers had made two critical mistakes. First, they'd used the wrong kind of explosive, too little and the wrong type. Second, in their panic, they'd connected one of the detonators improperly. And there was a third factor they couldn't have predicted. The bridge had been built by Russian prisoners of war during World War I, and those prisoners had built it too well. Every beam, every rivet, every connection was over-engineered. The bridge was supposed to last for decades, and by God, it was going to. Sergeant Alexander Drabik reached the eastern bank first. He later said he didn't know how he survived. He just kept running, figuring that if he moved fast enough, the German machine gunners couldn't hit him. He dove into a bomb crater and waited, expecting at any second that the bridge behind him would explode. Other soldiers poured across. Within minutes, American troops were on the eastern bank of the Rhine, the first Allied soldiers to cross Germany's great river barrier. But capturing the bridge was just the beginning. They had to hold it. Within hours, the Germans realized what had happened. Hitler himself was informed that evening that the Americans had captured an intact bridge across the Rhine. According to witnesses, he went into one of his legendary rages, screaming and pounding tables. He ordered the bridge destroyed immediately, at any cost. German commanders began throwing everything they had at that single span of steel. And I mean everything. Artillery batteries from all over the region were repositioned to fire on the bridge. Over the next 10 days, German guns, including massive 210mm howitzers, fired thousands of shells at the crossing. They hit the bridge 24 times on March 8th and 9th alone. But the Americans kept repairing it, working under constant fire. The Luftwaffe, what was left of it by that point in the war, flew bombing missions. Some of the very first operational jet aircraft, the Me-262s, screamed down out of the clouds trying to hit the bridge with bombs and rockets. American anti-aircraft guns shot many of them down, and the ones that got through couldn't land a decisive hit. The Germans even tried using V-2 rockets, those early ballistic missiles that had been terrorizing London. 11 V-2s were fired at the Remagen bridgehead. It was the only time in the entire war that Germany used V-2s against a tactical target rather than a city. But those primitive missiles weren't accurate enough. Not one came close to hitting the bridge. They sent frogmen, SS divers, down the river at night, trying to attach mines to the bridge supports. The Americans lit up the entire river with searchlights and shot at anything that moved in the water. German combat swimmers died in the freezing current. They floated mines down the river. They sent explosive-laden barges drifting toward the bridge, hoping they'd detonate on contact. American engineers stretched nets and booms across the water, anchored with massive weights. They welded Bailey Bridge panels together, lined them with steel wire, and filled them with rocks. Each anchor weighed several tons. Those booms caught and destroyed the German mines before they could reach the bridge. For 10 straight days, the battle raged. And while all this was happening, thousands of American troops poured across. Engineers worked around the clock, repairing damage, shoring up weakened sections, building protective barriers. The 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group. These men worked under fire, knowing that at any moment another shell could hit. Another bomb could fall. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave up. At around 3 in the afternoon, soldiers working on the bridge heard a terrible groaning sound, the sound of overstressed steel finally reaching its breaking point. They dropped their tools and ran, but it was too late for many of them. The entire bridge collapsed into the Rhine in a matter of seconds. 28 engineers were killed, swept away by the current or crushed under falling steel. Another 63 were injured. But by then it didn't matter. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge fell, American engineers had already built 2 pontoon bridges and a treadway bridge right next to it. Over 125,000 troops had crossed into Germany, along with tanks, artillery, supply trucks, everything an army needs. 7 full divisions were established on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and they weren't going anywhere. Now, here's where I want you to understand something about military engineering, because this is where the real story begins. The capture of the Remagen Bridge was dramatic, sure. It was brave and desperate, and it made headlines. But the bridges that came after, the ones the engineers built under fire, those were the real miracles. Building a bridge across a river is hard enough when you're doing it in peacetime, with all the time and equipment you need. Building a bridge across the Rhine under artillery fire, while the enemy is trying everything they can think of to kill you, that's something else entirely. Let me tell you about the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. This was one of the most decorated engineer units in the entire U.S. Army. They'd already seen brutal combat during the Battle of the Bulge, where they'd stopped a German armored breakthrough by blowing bridges directly in front of advancing panzer columns. Now, just 3 days after the Remagen Bridge was captured, they got new orders: build a treadway bridge across the Rhine, right next to the damaged Ludendorff Bridge. A treadway bridge is a specific type of military bridge. It uses aluminum pontoons and steel beams that can be assembled quickly and can support heavy vehicles. The one the 291st was ordered to build would be over 1,000 feet long, and they had to build it while German artillery was still firing, while the Luftwaffe was still trying to bomb the crossing, while the entire German army seemed determined to destroy anything that crossed that river. The 291st, supported by the 988th and 998th Treadway Bridge Companies, started construction at 8:30 on the morning of March 9th. The battalion's commander, Colonel David Pergrin, later said he was initially overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. But there was no time to be overwhelmed. There was only time to work. The engineers broke into specialized teams. Some men positioned the pontoons, massive inflatable floats that would support the bridge's weight. Others laid the steel treadway sections across the pontoons, connecting them with pins and bolts. Still others worked on the approaches, grading the riverbanks so vehicles could drive onto the bridge. Every man had a specific job, and they'd practiced these procedures hundreds of times in training. But training at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, or at some safe rear area base, is different from building under fire. German artillery shells were constantly landing around the construction site. Shrapnel would suddenly tear through the air, then would be working one moment and blown into the water the next. The 291st suffered 35 casualties during construction, killed or wounded by enemy fire. And then there was the river itself. The Rhine isn't like some peaceful stream. In March, swollen with snowmelt, it was running at about 6 knots. That's roughly 7 miles per hour, which doesn't sound like much until you try to stand in a current that strong. The river bottom was covered in gravel, which made it hard to anchor anything. Debris kept floating downstream, pieces of destroyed bridges, logs, sometimes even bodies, and smashing into the pontoons, threatening to rip sections of the bridge apart. But the engineers kept working. When a pontoon was damaged, they replaced it. When a section of treadway was hit by artillery, they pulled it out and installed a new one. They worked through the day, through the night, under searchlights that made them perfect targets for German gunners. They worked through rain and cold. They worked while their friends died beside them. 32 hours after they started, 32 hours of continuous work under fire, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion completed their bridge. At 5:10 in the evening on March 10th, they touched down on the eastern bank of the Rhine. It was 1,032 feet long, the first tactical bridge built by Allied forces across the Rhine, and the longest tactical bridge of its type ever assembled under enemy fire. Signs were posted at both ends. The longest tactical bridge built first across the Rhine, constructed by 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and the 298th Treadway Bridge Company. The men had earned the right to brag, but the engineers weren't done. Not even close. See, while all this was happening at Remagen, another drama was unfolding further south. on General George Patton's section of the front. Now, Patton was one of the most aggressive, glory-seeking commanders in the entire U.S. Army. He was also locked in a bitter rivalry with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was planning his own massive Rhine crossing further north, Operation Plunder, meticulously planned assault involving thousands of troops, massive artillery bombardments, and even paratroopers. Montgomery's operation was scheduled for March 23rd. Patton desperately wanted to cross the Rhine before Montgomery did. On the evening of March 22nd, elements of Patton's Third Army, specifically the 5th Infantry Division, reached the Rhine near the towns of Nierstein and Oppenheim, south of Mainz. Patton ordered an immediate crossing, not a carefully planned assault like Montgomery was preparing, not a massive operation with weeks of preparation, an immediate crossing. That night, the engineers of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion got their orders around 6 p.m. Build a pontoon bridge across the Rhine, tonight, in the dark, without any preliminary bombardment that might alert the Germans to what was happening. It was called Operation Silent Crossing, and it was one of the most audacious engineering feats of the war. The 249th had been practicing bridge construction, of course. That's what combat engineers did. They practiced building bridges, blowing bridges, clearing mines, all of it. But practicing in daylight in some safe training area is one thing. Building a 1,000-foot bridge across a major river at night, with the enemy just 400 yards away on the opposite bank, that's something no amount of training can fully prepare you for. The engineers started assembling their pontoons on the western bank. Because they were trying to maintain surprise, they couldn't use any machinery that made noise. No cranes, no engines, nothing that would alert German sentries. They had to push the pontoons into the water manually, fighting that 6-knot current in the dark. The first waves of engineers crossed by paddling, literally paddling across the Rhine in small assault boats, pulling guide ropes behind them. Once they got ropes strung across the river, they could start positioning the pontoons. Each pontoon had to be anchored precisely. Too far upstream and the current would slam the whole assembly sideways. Too far downstream and the bridge wouldn't line up with the approaches. Robert Shalato, a 19-year-old soldier with the 249th, later remembered how quiet everything was at first. No talking aloud, hand signals only. Men working by feel as much as by sight. And then, when they were several hours into the work, 3 German aircraft appeared overhead and started dropping bombs. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night. One bomb hit close enough to damage part of the bridge they'd already assembled. But the engineers just kept working. They completed the bridge in 18 hours. 18 hours, working through the night and into the next day. And when the sun rose on March 23rd, there was a 1,000-foot pontoon bridge stretching across the Rhine at Nierstein. Patton himself crossed it that morning, before Montgomery's massive operation even began. Patton, ever the showman, reportedly stopped halfway across and urinated into the Rhine, his own colorful way of expressing his contempt for German defenses. By the time Montgomery launched Operation Plunder on March 23rd, with its massive artillery bombardment, its thousands of troops, its paratroopers, and its elaborate planning, Patton had already been across the Rhine for hours. He'd beaten Montgomery to the punch, and his engineers had done it in a single night with nothing but muscle and determination. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 60,000 vehicles crossed the pontoon bridges at Nierstein. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, supply convoys, an entire army flowing across what had been Germany's last natural barrier. The bridges that the 249th and other engineer battalions built became vital arteries feeding the Allied advance into the German heartland. And here's what you need to understand. This happened all up and down the Rhine. At Remagen, at Nierstein, at Mainz, at Wesel. Everywhere the Allied armies reached the river. Combat engineers were there, building bridges under fire. The 17th Armored Engineer Battalion built a 1,152-foot treadway bridge near Wesel in just over 6 hours. The 1139th Engineer Combat Group built the longest tactical bridge in the entire European theater, 1,896 feet long, across the Rhine at Mainz. These men worked with equipment that, by today's standards, seems almost primitive. The M2 treadway bridge system used aluminum pontoons and steel beams that had to be manually positioned and connected. Each section weighed hundreds of pounds. There were no automated systems, no computer-guided anything. Just men, working with their hands, following procedures they'd learned at Fort Belvoir or Camp Swift or wherever they'd done their training. An engineer combat battalion typically had about 700 men, divided into companies. They trained for months to learn dozens of different skills, not just bridge building, but demolitions, mine clearing, road construction, fortification building, camouflage, mapping. Combat engineer had to be part construction worker, part soldier, part problem solver. They carried rifles and could fight as infantry when needed, and they often did, but their real weapon was their knowledge. The Corps of Engineers required 727 different occupational specialists per 1,000 troops. Think about that. You needed equipment operators who could drive bulldozers and cranes. You needed carpenters who could work with wood and steel. You needed demolitions experts who understood explosives. You needed surveyors who could calculate distances and angles. You needed welders, electricians, mechanics. Some engineer battalions even had men trained in bridge hydraulics, understanding how water flows, how currents work, what kind of anchors you need for different river bottoms. All of this knowledge was put to the test at the Rhine crossings, and the engineers proved they were up to the challenge. But here's something most people don't realize. While all these dramatic bridge operations were happening, Navy sailors were also there. Yes, sailors hundreds of miles from the ocean. The Navy had formed special boat units, Task Unit 122.5.1 and Task Unit 122.5.2, equipped with LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle personnel, and LCMs, landing craft, mechanized. These were the same boats that had landed troops at Normandy, at Sicily, at countless Pacific islands. Now they were being trucked overland, through France and Belgium and into Germany. To help cross the Rhine, villagers in northern France that march saw one of the strangest sights of the war. 36-foot and 50-foot landing craft being hauled down country roads on massive trailers. When the roads were too narrow, bulldozers would literally knock down buildings to let the boats through. Trees were cut down by the hundreds. It must have looked insane. Boats floating across fields miles from any water. But when those boats reached the Rhine, they proved their worth. Navy crews ran ferry services, transporting troops and equipment across the river, while the engineers were building bridges. At Remagen, Navy boats helped position pontoons for the bridges, using their engines to hold sections in place against the current. When the current threatened to push the pontoon bridge out of alignment, 2 LCVPs just parked themselves against the bulge of the bridge and held it steady, their engines running at full throttle, pushing 6 knots worth of thrust southward to offset the river's 6-knot thrust northward. 1 Navy boat unit ferried over 14,000 troops and 400 vehicles across the Rhine in just 10 days. Sailors worked alongside soldiers under the same artillery fire, taking the same risks. When a naval officer was killed by German fire at the Mainz crossing, his men kept working. The coordination required for all of this was staggering. You had infantry divisions that needed to get across. You had armor units with tanks that weighed 30 or 40 tons each. You had supply convoys bringing ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. You had signal corps units stringing communication lines. You had medics treating wounded, and all of it had to flow across bridges that were constantly under attack, constantly being repaired, constantly threatened by the river itself. Traffic control became critical. Military police stood at both ends of every bridge, directing traffic, making sure vehicles didn't bunch up, because if too many heavy vehicles got on a bridge at once, it could collapse or sink. Infantry had to be told to break step when they crossed, because if hundreds of soldiers marched in rhythm, the swaying motion could damage the bridge structure. Engineers stood by at all times with repair materials. When a pontoon was hit, they'd have crews ready to replace it. When anchors started dragging, they'd reinforce them. They'd monitor the water level constantly, because if the river rose too high, the bridge could be swept away. If it dropped too low, pontoons could ground on the river bottom. And through all of this, they were still being shot at. German artillery never let up. At some crossings, engineers suffered casualty rates of over 30%. These weren't men dying in glorious charges or dramatic tank battles. These were men dying while hammering bolts into steel beams, drowning when they were knocked off pontoons, blown apart by shells while they were trying to anchor cables. The casualty numbers tell their own story. When the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed, 28 engineers died, and 63 were wounded in a matter of seconds. That was just one incident. Across all the Rhine crossing operations, hundreds of engineers were killed or wounded. Second lieutenants, young officers leading engineer platoons, had the highest casualty rate of any rank in some divisions. In Italy, a study found that second lieutenants made up less than 1% of a division's strength, but accounted for nearly 3% of all casualties. Why such high casualties? Because engineers had to go first. When an infantry unit needed to cross a river, the engineers had to be there ahead of them, building the bridge. When a position needed to be fortified, engineers had to go forward under fire to build it. When mines needed to be cleared, engineers had to walk through the minefield. High exposure equals high casualties, but they kept volunteering. The Corps of Engineers had no shortage of men willing to join. Part of it was pride. Being an engineer meant you had skills. You had knowledge that not everyone possessed. Part of it was the knowledge that what you did mattered. Every bridge you built saved lives. Every road you constructed got supplies to the front faster. Every fortification you erected gave infantrymen better protection. And part of it was just the satisfaction of building something. Even in the middle of a war, even under fire, there's something deeply human about the act of construction. You take raw materials, steel and aluminum and wood and rope, and you turn them into something functional, something that serves a purpose. You solve problems. When the current's too strong for standard anchors, you improvise. You weld Bailey bridge panels together and fill them with rocks to make anchors heavy enough to hold. When German air attacks threaten your bridge, you set up anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. When debris threatens to damage your pontoons, you string protective nets across the water. Engineers are, by nature, problem solvers. Give them a challenge and they'll find a way. The Rhine was a hell of a challenge, and they found a way after the war. Military historians analyzed the Rhine crossings and concluded they were among the most important operations of the entire European campaign. The capture of the Remagen Bridge and the subsequent bridges built by engineers accelerated the Allied advance by at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. That's 2 or 3 fewer weeks of war, thousands of lives saved on both sides, cities that weren't destroyed, concentration camps that were liberated sooner. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, called the Remagen Bridge worth its weight in gold. His chief of staff said it materially hastened the end of the war. Field Marshal Montgomery, despite his rivalry with Patton, acknowledged that the American Rhine crossings were masterful operations, but the engineers themselves didn't think of it that way. When you talk to veterans of these operations, and there are fewer and fewer of them left now, as time marches on, they don't talk about how they changed the course of the war. They talk about the details. They remember the sound of artillery shells screaming overhead. They remember the cold of the Rhine water when they fell in. They remember the weight of the treadway sections they carried. They remember the names of buddies who didn't make it across. Robert Shalotto, that 19-year-old from the 249th who helped build the bridge at Nierstein, attended a memorial dedication there in 2017 when he was 92 years old. 4 generations of his family came with him. He stood on the bank of the Rhine and remembered that night in March 1945 when he and his fellow engineers had quietly paddled across in darkness, knowing German soldiers were just a few hundred yards away, knowing that at any moment they might be discovered and killed. With the enemy only 400 yards away, it was a stealth project, and no noise was permitted, he said. The initial waves of engineers had to cross by paddling. No motorized craft were permitted until later. He remembered the German planes attacking. During construction, dropping bombs, all 3 of them, though only 1 bomb did any damage. He remembered working through the night, exhausted, scared, but knowing the job had to get done. Colonel David Pergrin, who commanded the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion at Remagen, later wrote about how he felt when his men completed their bridge. Not triumph, not glory, just relief. Relief that they'd done what they'd been asked to do. Relief that the bridge was standing. Relief that now the infantry could cross, that tanks could cross, that maybe finally this terrible war could be brought to an end. See, that's the thing about engineers. They're not in it for glory. They're in it to get the job done. There's a motto that the Corps of Engineers uses, essayons. It's French. It means, let us try. That's what those men did at the Rhine. They tried. They tried to build bridges under impossible conditions. They tried to keep working while shells landed around them. They tried to solve problems that had never been solved before. And they succeeded. Today, if you go to Remagen, you can visit a museum housed in the towers that once guarded the Ludendorff Bridge. The bridge itself was never rebuilt. The towers stand there as monuments, reminders of what happened there in March 1945. There's a plaque commemorating the 9th Armored Division's capture of the bridge. There's another for the engineer battalions that built the temporary bridges. At Nierstein, there's a memorial on the riverbank. A 2.3-ton granite block with copper plaques honoring the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion and Patton's Third Army. It sits at the exact spot where the first pontoon bridge was built. Behind the eye, monument. You can still see remnants of the anchor points they used. These memorials exist because people understand now what those engineers accomplished. At the time, it might have seemed like just another military operation, one of thousands happening across Europe as the war ground toward its conclusion. But with the perspective of history, we can see how crucial those bridges were. The Rhine crossings broke the back of German resistance in the West. Once Allied armies were across that river, there was no natural barrier left to stop them. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr was encircled and captured. Berlin fell to the Soviets from the east. On May 7, 1945, less than 2 months after the first Rhine bridges were built, Germany surrendered. Those engineers, those young men from small towns and big cities all across America, who'd trained at Fort Belvoir or Camp Swift or some other installation, who'd practiced building bridges in peaceful rivers back home, they'd helped end a world war. Not by shooting enemy soldiers, not by destroying tanks or dropping bombs, but by building, by constructing paths forward, by creating solutions. That's the lesson I want you to take from this story. War is terrible, destructive, tragic. But even in war, there are people whose job is to build rather than destroy. There are people who solve problems rather than create them. There are people who make paths forward. Those engineers at the Rhine never expected to be heroes. They expected to do their jobs, to follow their training, to serve their country. They didn't know they were going to change history. They just knew they had a river to cross and bridges to build. But they did change history. By doing their jobs, by working together, by refusing to quit even when conditions were impossible, they changed the world. I tell you this story now because I think we need to remember it. We live in a different world, facing different challenges. But the principle remains the same. Sometimes the hardest, most important work isn't the most dramatic. Sometimes it's the engineers working in the background, solving problems, building solutions, making progress possible. The Germans never expected American engineers to build floating bridges across the Rhine so quickly, under such terrible conditions. They thought the river would protect them, that even if the Allies reached it, crossing would take weeks of preparation. They underestimated American ingenuity, American determination, and American engineering skill. It was a mistake that cost them the war. So when you think about World War II, yes, remember the infantry storming beaches and the pilots flying missions and the sailors manning ships. But also remember the engineers. Remember the 291st at Remagen, building through artillery fire. Remember the 249th at Nierstein, working through the night in silence. Remember the 17th Armored Engineers, the 1139th Engineer Combat Group, all the other units who built the paths to victory. Remember that wars aren't just won by destruction. Sometimes they're won by construction. That's the story the Germans never expected. That's the story that changed everything. And that's the story I wanted to make sure you heard.